Hi there, I'm the Professor. Welcome to Office Hours, the show that's proudly irrelevant. Today we have Cavemen Rock, part whatever, Homo Heidelbergensis, or the quest for Excalibur. Wow, you're probably thinking, I wasn't expecting Bro to make that connection. Excalibur, what does Arthurian legend have to do with cavemen? Well, if you're a paleoanthropology nut like I am, then you already know. But if you don't know, don't Google it yet. That would ruin the surprise. So anyway, to start with, let's remember how I like to talk about the Wu-Tang time traveling elevator from their videos. So let's go ask Riza for the keys again, and let's go back to this time between 600,000 years ago and 300,000 years ago. All right. So Homo antecessor, and remember, his behavior we found to be, shall we say, a little bit atavistic, right? Um, so we discussed antecessor last time, and he's developed into or been replaced by the larger brained Homo heidelbergensis. Okay, named of course for the German city of Berlin. Just kidding, Heidelberg, right? So where the fossils were first found. So the line of succession here with antecessor is a little bit fuzzy, right? So we don't know, was Heidelbergensis a descendant of antecessor? Was he a descendant of Homo erectus that bypassed the antecessor line? We're not sure. And this is a matter of heated debate among the approximately 7 people who care. I'm not really one of them. I'm not into genetics. At any rate, by 600,000 years or so, 600,000 years ago, I should say, or so, we see Homo antecessor replaced generally throughout Europe by Heidelbergensis, right? Now, we're focusing on Europe right now because of the amount of material that we have, right? Lots of cool stuff was going on in other parts of the world right now, but and we're just discovering it now. But right now we're focusing on Europe just because we have a lot of material from this part of the world, okay? So if the other stuff is going on, but just wait for it. We'll do it later. One thing that I really like about these Heidelbergensis guys is that they were some of the first archaic hominins to look reasonably like us up close. Remember, if you saw an Erjectus from a distance, you'd recognize it as vaguely human-like, but up close you would change your mind. On the other hand, with Homo heidelbergensis, you'd have to look much closer to see the differences, right? So, for one thing, Heidelbergensis was almost as tall as we are, right? So they were around average 5 feet 7, and that's pretty close to modern humans also. So that's one way they look like us. For another, they didn't have body hair. All right. So remember, the process of body hair loss began sometime around the tenure of antecessor, or around a million years ago, right? So Heidelbergensis by this time had lost his body hair to the point of being comparable with us. Maybe he was a particularly hairy kind of guy, but no hairier than somebody would be today. So let's see what these guys would look like. We have a wonderful variety of individuals from Homo heidelbergensis remains, and we actually see some cool variation between these individuals. So we can actually put together, I don't know who did this, but make family portraits supposedly of heidelbergensis. Of course, the individuals that these reconstructions are based on probably didn't all live at the same time, but look, that's not the point. How wonderful it is to see them together in a community and look at them as they looked at each other. There's something almost mystical, I think, about looking at these pictures. These are the first human ancestors where I feel personally as though I could look into their eyes and see my fellow man, my brother or sister in the romance of the ages. When I look into these pictures, even more than other reconstructions, I feel like I'm looking through a window in time. I I would love to hang out with these guys and just be friends with them. And I say friends deliberately, you know. I can be friends with my cat, but that's not the same thing as being friends with another human, right? When I look at these pictures, I have to imagine that if these guys and I got to know each other, we could actually forge something approximating a human friendship. How cool would that be? So let's carry this thread a little bit. How did Homo heidelbergensis behave? Could we have been bros with them? Now, of course, this is kind of a ridiculous question. It's absurd. Roll your eyes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's an important one. No matter how much we love our pets, right? Our bonds with them are intrinsically different from our bonds with other people. So, could we have genuinely made a true human connection with these creatures? First of all, we should remember Homo heidelbergensis was not behaviorally modern. There is no evidence for art, symbolism, religion, or any of the marks of a behaviorally modern society. Okay. They probably could not speak to the extent that we can. They probably could not tolerate strangers to the extent that we can. Still, they were certainly no dummies. Okay. They stood on the shoulders of their erectus and antecessor forebears who passed on to them. Remember, the persistence hunting strategy. Also, the incredibly useful Acheulean hand axe. And last of all, the control, but not necessarily the manufacture of fire. Now, if these guys practiced persistence hunting, it follows that they knew how animal footprints worked. And that's huge because to understand how footprints work necessitates an implicit understanding of cause and effect, right? That's an incredibly complex mental process. And just like, remember, the Acheulean hand axes had this pre planned nature, right? And this kind of bringing the mental into the physical, that's the same kind of thing going on with following animal tracks. So it would have taken thousands upon agonizing thousands of generations for everybody to get on board with this. But by the time of heidelbergensis, they had been axe planning and persistence hunting for a good million years. And furthermore, the advantages of hand axes and persistence hunting, right, suggest that once they're developed, they would present an evolutionary advantage. They would spread at least fairly quickly. And let's look at fire, right? They had probably a million years by now to practice with fire. So essentially, we have these three main behaviors that Heidelbergensis was able to do, right? Plan outcomes to make hand axes, anticipate cause and effect to follow tracks, and follow step-by-step processes to control fire, right? Each of these abilities, I think, represents a giant leap for mankind, a successful jump over the yawning chasm between man and beast. If if Heidelbergensis was able to perform these functions and do these mental processes, I would say that he finally, definitively, would be more like us than like a chimpanzee. All right. So I think it's safe to say yes, you could forge a genuine human to human relationship with these creatures. That is not, again, to say they're behaviorally modern. They probably couldn't speak, they couldn't have learned to read, they couldn't have written a symphony, but the groundwork was there. So I think even if they couldn't understand human friendship, they would feel it. Now, why am I waxing poetic about these guys? I mean, this is 400,000 years ago. These guys are still halfway between us and those wacky cannibals that we met last time. Fair enough. But I like these guys because we do have evidence with them of something very deep down that resonates with us today. It is possible, and don't get upset. I said possible, not certain, that somewhere around this time Homo heidelbergensis caught a glimpse, faint though it may have been, of the spiritual. So let's head back to Atapuerca, remember, which is the mountain, more like a hill in Spain, where they found the antecessor remains, right? And it is here also that we find some good Heidelbergensis data. So it's here that we find the most metal paleoanthropological site in the world. The Pits of Bones. Isn't that name badass? Earlier on, I talked about how it's a shame that there are lots of good Viking metal bands, but no caveman metal bands, at least as far as I know. Well, if you're starting that band, I've got your name right here, the Pits of Bones. Take it, it's yours. Just give me a shout out at the Grammys, provided Jethro Tull doesn't steal your award. Anyway, the Pit of Bones gives us a wonderful glimpse of this Homo heidelbergensis population. There's this wide range of individuals that we can study. I think 28 of both sexes and a variety of ages. And we can also find clues about their lives, just like we did with Grandpa Joe and Turkana Boy, right? So, for example, let's look at one of these guys. This poor schlub, he sustained an injury on his face, but it healed in kind of a weird way, rendering him goofy looking for the rest of his life. Fortunately, he was a good listener and had a really sweet personality, so he could still get dates. But even more interesting to me, anyway, than these physical remains are the behavioral implications of their placement here. If we find a pit full of Homo heidelbergensis bones, it raises the possibility of these remains having been put there on purpose. Could we be looking at an early form of the deliberate burial? And if so, what are the implications for their behavior? Could we infer the presence of primitive religious beliefs and rituals? Or if not, what are some other possible explanations? This is a big question. Now, for modern humans, the way we dispose of our dead, right, varies by religious or cultural tradition. Whatever the method, however, every culture has some way of doing this. Evolutionarily, this must have emerged because dead bodies bring disease and dangerous scavengers. It is therefore natural to jump to the conclusion of this must be a burial or a funeral. We must, however, detach ourselves from our modern cognitive abilities and look at the pit of bones from the view of Homo heidelbergensis. There is no clear evidence of religious belief, or indeed of abstract thought of any kind, at this time depth. Even if the bodies were left there deliberately, the conclusion is unavoidable that Homo heidelbergensis was not disposing of his dead here for ritual reasons, but rather simply because a giant hole in the ground is a convenient place to dispose of dead bodies. Doing something with dead bodies does not necessarily imply the existence of religion, despite modern sensibilities. So we can say, there was no funerary ritual at the Pit of Bones. Now, that fact would probably be agreed upon if it weren't for one important discovery. As archaeologists dug through the pit, they made this incredible find. Holy moly, just look at that hand axe. That is one nice hand axe. Am I right? Not only is it well crafted, but it's aesthetically beautiful as well. It's made of this beautiful red quartzite, and it would produce this sparkling effect in the sun. And what's more, the material appears not to have been sourced locally, which means that it was brought from some distance away. I don't remember where I read that, but I did somewhere. Uh, anyway, these items, at any rate, they take a lot of effort to make, right? And often are the difference between life and death for their users. So scientists, as a nod to its beautiful workmanship and the importance it must have had in the lives of these creatures, have given this particular tool the very cool and beautiful name of Excalibur. And that's why I gave this episode this name, because Excalibur is this wonderful hand axe that was left behind in these finds. So, looking at this frankly amazing piece, one has to wonder, what it was doing at the bottom of the pit of bones. You know, you almost don't want to say this because it would just be such an incredible development, but could it have been left there on purpose? Are we seeing in Excalibur the first rumblings of humanity's belief in the afterlife? And I know it sounds crazy. I mean, besides, it could have just been that some guy was snooping around the cave, he fell down the pit, and his hand axe fell with him. Okay, fair enough. I acknowledge that this is possible and perhaps even probable. Still, looking at the exceptional quality of this hand axe brings to mind the haunting possibility that we could be looking at some kind of funeral offering. What could this have looked like? Well, back to the Wu Tang elevator. Let's go find out. It was 400,000 years ago. A tribe of Homo heidelbergensis lived in the forests and plains of what is now northern Spain. They hunted animals like the elk and the woolly rhinoceros by following their tracks, running them down, and killing them with spears. This spear, for example, was found in Germany and dates to 400,000 years ago. Now, these spears were mostly sharpened sticks, but they may have worked out the idea of sticking a hand axe on the end. You never know. Now, hand axes, of course, were incredibly important items, and to be good at making hand axes was to be, shall we say, evolutionarily successful. Sorry. They had no language and communicated perhaps through onomatopoeic vocal calls or occasional utterances of isolated, like proto words, maybe. But they didn't have music or art, but they could recognize and liked producing maybe like audible rhythms and visual patterns without really understanding why. Remember, the Trinil engravings indicate this ability. So they felt love, but they had no concept of it. They valued courage, intelligence, and altruism, again, without having any comprehension of these abstract notions, right? But behaviors like holding someone's hand or waving or hugging someone, things like that, they probably existed among them and were done in specific times and places. And they also realized that dead bodies attract scavengers, and so they had a habit of just throwing their dead down this pit somewhere, right? And because that's the most convenient place, and it's this cave where nobody lives, and let's just do it there, right? And so it was here that they habitually deposited dead bodies, thereby avoiding scavengers and pestilence. Now, after a few generations, this habit became so ingrained that even if it would have been convenient to do so elsewhere, they were still disposing of the dead in this place. Perhaps it had become a tradition in the community. It was the place of death, where children placed their fathers and were eventually placed themselves by their children. They may have had some vague idea of their own mortality and an idea that they too would suddenly drop, or sorry, someday drop into this great darkness. Maybe that they mourned their dead is virtually certain, since mourning behavior is present in both humans and chimpanzees. Could it be that specific actions were performed in the course of mourning in association with the disposal of the body? Perhaps certain vocal calls were made that were exclusive to this activity. Perhaps bodies were disposed of by the same member of the community. Perhaps even a primitive taboo had developed wherein this place, the place of death, was avoided by the living, and not just because that's where the scavengers hung out. Well, anyway, finally, one day, right, somebody was disposing of a body, and maybe this was someone, some family member or something like that, and they're in the course of mourning. They throw the body down the hole, and it just seemed right for some unknowable reason to toss that person's hand axe down with them. He wasn't sure why he did it, but he had the feeling that he needed to do it. He had this feeling of shouldness, I think. This should feeling that he should dispose of the dead in this place. He should make the designated ululations at the time of death and when carrying the body. Ululations, I think that's how you say it. Ululation, whatever. And he had this deep gut feeling that he should drop his friend down and then drop the hand axe down with him to leave it with its owner. And perhaps, just perhaps, this feeling was developed enough that he could conceptualize some idea that his friend's death was not really the end. And in that hope, perhaps, he left his favorite tool. Now, given the isolation of this occurrence, it does not seem that the community was consistently depositing grave goods with the dead. And thus, it does not seem that they consistently had the cognitive ability to sense the need for grave goods or for funerary ritual. But one day, it could be that somebody was getting rid of his loved one, and he thought something like, wherever my buddy's going, this thing should go with him too. His hand axe should go with him. And there's that should again, right? That shouldness. This individual felt the shouldness that was the first stirring, I think, of the human consciousness, of morality, of religion. And that individual stood, although he did not know it, at the precipice of perhaps the most important development in humanity's behavioral evolution thus far observed. Now, if you are a theologian looking for a date to the fall of man, I would put it around here someplace. You see, shouldness is not mustness, right? And it necessarily gives us free will. The option being there not to do as you should. A sense of shouldness, therefore, is a prerequisite for the ability to sin. It is in this sense demonstrated by a primitive funeral offering that we're seeing the first stirring of the conscience, that noblest of man's faculties. Now, before you neck-bearded basement trolls rev up your keyboards, I'm not saying that this is definitely evidence of funeral practices or even of deliberate burial. I'm just saying that it could be, and wouldn't it be cool if it was? I don't know. So this, I think, at any rate, is the verdict. In terms of our interaction with them, suppose we could. I don't think if we met a Homo heidelbergensis, we could interact with them like we interact with each other, but we almost could. They couldn't have spoken, but perhaps their nonverbal communication was human-like. Perhaps important physical actions at the core of our being, like hand clapping or pointing or whistling, would have had some meaning to them. And I think they laughed and cried just like we do, and for the same reasons that we do. And I believe there was that shouldness. I believe, my opinion, which we would call a conscience. So on the big stuff, we connect with these creatures on a very, very fundamental level. We have crossed the behavioral Rubicon, and by this time, almost certainly had embarked on the path to behavioral modernity. By this time, if not earlier, our ancestors were behaving more like us than like our primitive cousins. Now, before I go, there's one thing that I want to leave you guys with, okay? So, under the direction of the man, the myth, the legend, the towering badass, Svante Pabo, and his team of science nerds, we can now study scraps of Homo heidelbergensis DNA, potentially giving us more clues about their story. Now, I would be interested to see whether this genetic data could give us any clues to their behavior. So let me know what you think if you do happen to be Svante Pabo or one of his team of science nerds watching this. So, or if you just have an opinion, let me know. I'll see you guys next time, and we're going to start looking at Neanderthals.